In this second part, let's continue with our discussion of James Weldon Johnson's Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man. We've already talked about just the framing of this work in terms of the audience. Now, one of the interesting things is to think about how the opening of the book begins to set up the context of the way that this story operates. And it sets up the premise and the manner in which the tone of the work and the unfolding of the work is going to take place. This is a rollicking novel. It's a novel that takes us, through from the south up to the north, to places like New York, adventures in New York to Europe. This man spends time in Europe and then he returns to the south. And returning to the south, he has a life experience that is going to transform him, and we'll pay attention to that in the third section of this talk. And then he moves back to New York, where he lives, and sort of where the story begins. The story begins with the premise. So I thought what I could do is just read the first the first chapter, the first two paragraphs, which I think are really telling in just making us think about it. He says, I know, this is how the book begins. This is the first chapter, chapter one. I know that in writing the following pages, I'm divulging the great secret of my life, the secret which for some years I have guarded far more carefully than any of my earthly possessions. And it is a curious study to me to analyze the motives which prompt me to do it. I feel that I'm led by the same impulse which forces the unfound out criminal to take somebody into his confidence, although he knows that the act is likely, even almost certain, to lead to his undoing. I know that I am playing with fire, and I feel the thrill which accompanies that most fascinating pastime. And back of it all, I think I find a sort of savage and diabolical desire to gather up all the little tragedies of my life and turn them into a practical joke on society. What a great opening! And there's another section that I want to get to, but in this moment, listen to the elements that I hear. He says he's guarded this secret for all his life, for more carefully than any earthly possession that he has. And his earthly possessions are his children, his wife, and his family, and so on. And then he says, it's a curious study to me to analyze the motives which prompt me to do it. Why am I prompted to tell this story, to reveal this secret? And it's a secret that is going to be, he says, he knows full well will be his undoing. And he likens it to two things. One, he likens it to a criminal who is going to confess the crime that he committed, that he's kept for a secret for everybody, divulge the crime that he's committed, and knowing full well that once he's found out, it's probably going to be his demise and his undoing. But this idea that the very act of hiding the fact that he has black blood in him represents a crime. So that's the first thing he likens it onto. And the second thing he likens it onto is a practical joke. He says, I find a sort of savage and diabolical desire to gather up all the little tragedies of my life and turn them into a practical joke. A practical joke on whom? On society. So in a sense, he's saying this is like a joke on society because you have taken me to be a white man. But all along, I've known that I'm actually somebody who is black. At least by your definitions, I'm black. And therefore, by these definitions, the joke is on you because you've taken me into your community and into your society and made this of me. And one of the first things that we will talk about is this question of his blackness, his relative blackness, and the nature of blackness in American society. They are constructed around American slave society, a number of systems and cultures and mores and laws that were built to continue to enhance, continue to ensure the wealth of the enslaving class, the wealth of the planter, the wealth of the society itself, of white society. In other words, these laws were constructed to make slavery its most lucrative for the white. The first one we talked about was the literal phrase that says that the child takes the status directly from the mother. the child takes this, and that became law. So that if a black woman had a child, and black enslaved woman had a child, that child, no matter who the father was, no matter what degree of complexion that child had, would be a slave, by automatically be a slave, as long as the mother was a slave. So this was, and as I explained earlier, this was a system, and you know, this is something that Frederick Douglass explored beautifully in his biography, where he says this is one of the great tools of slavery and of slave society to enrich the blacks. So he said the world of the South is littered with mulatto children, all these children fathered by white men, and given birth to, mothered by white women, and white men who are forcing themselves on these black women. But what they are actually doing is building their property, their property ownership. So that is the first one. The second one has to do with color and race. And what happens in American society is that by law, it became clear that in order for that first one to hold, it also had to propose that the one-drop theory of blackness would prevail. One-drop theory meant that if you had one drop of black blood, any drop of black blood that is evident in you, it then turned the whole body into a black body. This had nothing to do with what the person looked like. So if in one's ancestry there was black blood, it meant that you were black. Now, in some colonies, that is some of the slave colonies and some of the slave societies in America, in the Americas, they had an actual gradation. You know, if you were 1/8 of, if you had 1/8 or 1/6 black blood, then you were, and the rest of it is white, then you were ostensibly accepted to be white. But the one drop theory meant that if you had a drop of black blood, then it meant that you were black. And in a funny kind of way, even to this day in America, we still hold to that view. It's a very peculiar thing. We may talk about people being mixed race and so on and so forth, but fundamentally, the idea still prevails that says that if you have one drop of black blood, it doesn't apply to other races, right? But if you have a drop of black blood, it means that you are ostensibly, or you can claim to be black. And in a sense, that is the theory, because of course this man, the ex-colored man, didn't look black. He looked white. Yet he carried around him the knowledge that he had a mixed race mother who was black in part. And that knowledge meant that and when he declared it and finally exposed himself to his wife and told her, look, the truth is that this is who my mother was, she was devastated, because she felt that he had tricked her and that he was doing something damage, because he couldn't tell anybody else. It's a very fascinating dilemma, right? So these two fundamental laws and principles of African American society, of American society, of American society, some of which still persist, were guiding this idea of it's a criminal act and it's a practical joke. A criminal act to lie about my race, and a practical joke. And that only operates in a society in which being black is a bad thing. Being black is a dangerous thing. So he ends that section that opens, and this is one of the things I wanted to tie it in. He ends it by saying, and two, I suffer a vague feeling of unsatisfaction, of regret, of almost remorse, from which I'm seeking relief, and of which I shall speak in the last paragraph of this account. Again, these are the feelings that have led him to tell this story about himself. To tell the story that he was born with the understanding that eventually, when he was about 6 years old, that he was a black boy, and then went on to find ways to live in ways that he could both protect himself be sort of black, move into black community and try and live as a black, and then choose at some point that he's going to give that up and just go to white. And why does he do that? But he says he suffers a vague feeling of unsatisfaction, of regret, of almost remorse, from which I'm seeking relief and of which I shall speak. And his regret is about an action that he takes, right? So what I would love to do is to zip to the end of the work, and there's another passage that ends the work. It's the last section in the book. It's almost the last lines in the book, where he then declares himself and says, and it connects to the beginning of the book. This is what frames it, right? And it helps us to understand what the intention of the book becomes. At the end of the book, he says, and by the way, this is all spoiler alert. I've told you everything. I mean, he does, and that's going to happen in this talk. But it's okay. It's still exciting to read. But here's how it ends. The end of the novel. The novel ends with these lines: "My love for my children makes me glad that I am what I am, and keeps me from desiring to be otherwise. And yet, when I sometimes open a little box in which I still keep my fast yellowing manuscripts," that's this book that we're reading, "the only tangible remnants of a vanished dream, a dead ambition," no, sorry, the music that he was trying to create. He was trying to create music, classical music, out of black music. He says, "I still keep my fast yellowing manuscripts, the only tangible remnants of a vanished dream, a dead ambition, a sacrificed talent. I cannot repress the thought that, after all, I have chosen the lesser part, that I have sold my birthright for a mess of pottage." The allusion, of course, in that last line, "birthright for a mess of pottage," is an allusion to the Esau and Jacob story from the Bible, from the book of Genesis. Esau was the one who had was the firstborn child um, of Isaac. Isaac was their father, and Esau was the firstborn child. And Esau then of Jacob was the secondborn child, and and Jacob wanted to get to be the first guy, right? And his mother favored him. And so Esau, who was a hunter and a bit particular, in sort of, fiery individual and so on and so forth. One day Jacob goes hunting and cooks an amazing meal. And he then says, and Esau says, "Give me some of that food." And Jacob says, "Well, if you give me your birthright, I will let you have this porridge, this meal, this meaty, delicious meal." And of course, that's what he does. Esau sells his birthright for a mess of potash. So what the ex-colored man is saying is, of course, when he decided to abandon his ambitions of becoming an active leader in the black community and so on and so forth, but to choose to go white, that he was in fact giving up his birthright for what he now calls a mess of potash. The only things that are keeping him, he says, is that, "I love my children, and it makes me glad that I am what I am." So the fact that he has children that he cares about, it makes him happy. Um, it's worth paying attention to that. The paragraph that comes before that, he says something very interesting. He says, "Several years ago, I attended a great meeting in the interest of Hampton Institute at Carnegie Hall." These are real places, obviously, as you know. "The Hampton students sang the old songs and awoke memories that left me sad. Among the speakers were R.C. Ogden, ex-ambassador Coet, and Mark Twain. But the greatest interest of the audience was centered in Booker T. Washington, and not because he so much surpassed the others in eloquence, but because of what he represented with so much earnestness and faith. And it is this that all of that small but gallant band of colored men who are publicly fighting the cause of their race have behind them. Even those who oppose them know that these men have the eternal principles of right on their side, and they will be victors even though they should go down in defeat. Beside them, I feel small and selfish. I'm an ordinarily successful white man who has made a little money. They are men who are making history and a race. I, too, might have taken part in a work so glorious." So the moment where he begins to ask himself, have I done the right thing, is when he sees Booker T. Washington, also a mixed race man, but clearly African in his expression. And Booker T. Washington has done so much, but he says he wishes that he had chosen that path, chosen the path to consider himself a black leader and to take leadership among the black race and therefore leave with dignity, even if he suffers for it. but he chose not to. And the question is, why does he choose not to? Of course, it's a little presumptuous, right? It's almost arrogant because, of course, his presumption is that I was brilliant, and as a white man, I'm ordinary. But if I was black, if I chose to be black with the same skills that I have, I would be extraordinary. There's something arrogant and kind of problematic about his view. And James Weldon Johnson knows that. James Weldon Johnson knows that the ex-colored man is an unreliable narrator. And you have to read him as an unreliable narrator. And James Weldon Johnson does not. While he empathizes with the ex-colored man, he's criticizing the ex-colored man. He's criticizing the ex-colored man because, of course, the ex-colored man still perceives his whiteness to be more than a privilege, but the better part of him. And James Weldon Johnson clearly does not agree with this. And so he's exposing the hypocrisy of the ex-colored man in that moment. Okay, interesting. So we'll come back to this in the third part.